which leads to the military revolution, in which there are absolutely no mistakes, despite what Black may have told you last week. But indeed, in some quarters, military revolution received a bad press. In their review of the first edition, which came out in 1988, I'm going to go through in order the items on this list. I've written them out for you because even if your English is perfect, it's hard to follow the exact references. So the first one is me, of course, me and my book, and then this review article by Bert Hall and Kelly de Vries, which began that they were disappointed by the number of lost opportunities to create a genuine comparative perspective that might aid our assessment of technology and change in military affairs. De Vries and Hall concluded that Geoffrey Parker's grand and vivid vision of Europe's military revolution could have made room for such an analysis, but his failure to do so may mean that his thesis will have a short lifespan. Well, John Childs, next name down on your list, agreed. He grumbled in his introduction to warfare in the 17th century. Over the past 50 years, military historians of 16th and 17th century Europe have been obsessed with defining the nature and chronological location of a military revolution. And the section in which he discussed that is called Death of the Military Revolution. Most comprehensive of all, in 2006, Christopher Duffy denounced, I quote, the notion of a military revolution which distorted the study of early modern military history for decades from the 1950s. But there were one or two favorable comments. One came from Noam Chomsky, which I had not expected. Another came from an Islamic fundamentalist. I quote, the lessons for Muslims today are obvious. To ensure freedom from and victory against the adversaries, the West, military adaptation and innovation are imperative. According to Monsieur Black, it has become, quote, the single most influential concept in studies of early modern warfare. While according to Robert Citino, the military revolution, its exact definition, and the controversies that swirl around it have dominated early modern military historiography for the last 30 years. So the book's done okay. If you want to know more, I recommend the collection of essays, Clifford Rogers' The Military Revolution Debate, which brings together all the major contributions on the subject, some of which I'm going to detail now. There is also a group discussion. The next item down on your list, Parker has a debate with Showalter, Black and Clark, The Military Revolution, a forum, which is reprinted. As I say, the bibliographic details are on the sheet in front of you. There's an issue of the Canadian Journal of Sociology, which looks at the role of military factors in the rise of the West. And in 2014, that's this year, later this year, the Journal of World History will publish a clutch of essays on globalizing the military revolution. Let me give you a little bit of background on the book and then give you some idea of how I plan to revise it. The French edition brought out by, I think, Gallimard in Livre de Poche is in fact the same as before. It's the 1996 second edition. There's a little one, much smaller, Livre de Poche. But I plan to do something rather grander than that. Actually, if you could hold that up, sir, thank you very much. There it is, so buy your copy. I could use the royalties. Michael Roberts is the man who invented the concept. He was a Swedish historian, and he was elected to the chair of modern history in the Queen's University of Belfast. In England, Ireland, Scotland, as in France, it is the custom of the new professor to give an inaugural lecture. And Roberts wondered what he would talk about. He decided that Swedish history would interest nobody. So he wrote specially this idea that perhaps the Swedes have invented something important in the 17th century, a new way of fighting. And he called it the military revolution. He invents the term. In a lecture which he gives in Belfast in Northern Ireland in January 1955. And he focuses on 4 changes in the art of war between 1560 and 1660. His military revolution takes a century, and it has 4 elements. First, he sees a revolution in tactics as armored cavalry succumb to the firepower of infantry armed with gunpowder weapons. Second, he argued that this development led to a rapid increase in army size, In some states, the size of the armed forces increases tenfold. And this in turn forces upon commanders a revolution in strategy in order to bring these larger armies into action. So there's the first three elements: a revolution in tactics, a rapid increase in army size, and a revolution in strategy. The fourth element in Roberts's military revolution is the increased impact of war on society. Greater costs, greater damage, greater administrative challenges posed by the augmented armies. This made it more difficult to wage war. It made war more of a burden and far more of a challenge than ever previously, with implications for the civilian population and for their rulers. Now, there's a lot more in Roberts's inaugural lecture. He looks at the creation of a specialized military education, the emergence of military academies, the articulation of laws of war, the emergence of an enormous literature on the art of war. All of those are in the article. The lecture becomes an article. But those are the four elements. The transcendent importance of the changes in tactics, army size, strategy, and impact. Now, you have to remember what military history looked like in 1955. According to Sir Charles Oman, who was probably the leading military historian of the day, and I quote, "The 16th century constitutes a most uninteresting period in European military history." A decade later, Major General J.F.C. Fuller, another prominent military historian, writes, "Militarily, little is to be learnt from the French wars of religion." Ha! Sandberg, take note. "And not much either from the revolt of the Netherlands." There's me gone. Right. So Roberts is challenging a paradigm. The military revolution is very much a new voice, and it probably would have remained anonymous. It probably would have remained forgotten had it not, like most inaugural lectures, not yours, of course, and not yours, Professor Nobel-Durie, but most inaugural lectures sink without trace. And what redeems Roberts is the fact that Belfast endows a set of lectures given every year by a prominent historian. There's 4 lectures. They're called the Wiles Lectures. And in 1956, the year after Roberts's, they're given by someone called Sir George Clarke, who is the second name on the second side of the crib sheet I gave you. And Clarke publishes those lectures as War and Society in the 17th Century. And he plugs the military revolution. This, in fact, becomes the fulcrum of military history. That is what popularizes the military revolution. Roberts creates it, Clarke propagates it. Soon, almost every work on early modern Europe that mentioned warfare include a paragraph or two endorsing the Roberts thesis, which in turn inspired many young scholars to undertake the study of war in the early modern period. Roberts' essay also inspired me when I read it during my final year as an undergraduate at Cambridge. Shortly afterwards, however, when I started doing research on Spanish military history, it seemed to me that the paradigm didn't work. After all, the Swedish army meets the Spanish army only once, at the Battle of Nördlingen in 1634, and the Swedish army is trashed. It completely fails. So, what good was the military revolution? I thought this was rather clever, so I put the last chapter of my thesis was called A Military Revolution ? Which attacked Roberts and his thesis. And of course, the Cambridge History Faculty Board appointed Roberts my examiner. I found this out when it was too late to change anything, and I went to my exam with a heavy heart. But that generous and gracious man said, "Well, I think you're right, but you could make your argument a lot stronger if you read the following." He gave me a little list of other things that would destroy his own theory, but he said, "It's not a conclusion. This is not a conclusion to what you're writing. Very interesting, but it doesn't work as a conclusion. Publish it as a separate article. Find another conclusion for your book about Spain and the Netherlands." So, being an obedient boy, and this side I'm thinking I was very, very lucky, I did exactly what Robert said. I published Military Revolution as an article in Journal of Modern History in 1976, so 20 years after Roberts publishes, and I made a separate conclusion to the book that became The Army of Flanders and the Spanish Road. The article criticized Roberts on 4 counts, or let me rephrase that. I expressed 4 regrets about the Roberts thesis. Number 1, where's the Navy? It's a military revolution, but the 16th and 17th century see the emergence of these huge battle fleets, which have never been seen in the world before. 20, 30, 100 ships of the line. They surely belong in a book about military change. I thought he had underestimated the importance of siege warfare. Roberts's military revolution is a revolution of positional warfare. Where are the sieges? I thought he'd overlooked the parallel between the parallel but independent changes by the armies fighting in the Netherlands. He said a little about Maurice of Nassau, but I thought the Nassau inventions were perhaps more important than the Swedish inventions. I thought the Swedes were imitators, the Dutch were the innovators. I probably would have ignored that. I probably would have left the matter there. But you know, in one's academic life, strange things happen. I was working at the archives of Simancas. Well, actually, Simancas closed at 2. I went to the swimming pool. And I opened a letter from Trinity College, Cambridge. This is 1982. And I opened the letter. It was from Trinity College, Cambridge. And they said, we would like you to give 4 lectures on military history in 1984, 2 years from now. So any subject, any period, just 4 lectures. Not more, not less, 4. And so I decided to explore my further doubts on the Roberts thesis in those lectures called the Lees-Knowles lectures. It seemed easy. After all, I'd written an article on the subject. How much more could there be? But it led me to a tour of the world in search of material about the military and naval history of early modern Europe and its outposts in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Those of you who've looked at the military revolution, some of you actually have a copy. Perhaps you've opened it. I didn't hear the cracking of virgin spines as you held your copies up. So there are really 4 linked assertions in my book. So we have the Roberts model. This is what I think I did. So the 4 linked assertions are as follows. Number 1, a series of innovations in the nature of warfare on sea and land in Western Europe between 1430 and 1630 combined to create a new way of war that really does merit the title military revolution. Only in Europe, only in Western Europe, only between 1430 and 1630. Second assertion, the combined impact of these innovations far exceeded the sum of the parts. They interact and they respond to outside stimuli, social change, economic growth, intellectual evolution, environmental changes. 3, almost all the innovations of the military revolution had medieval antecedents and non-European parallels. But, I argue, the scale of the changes in Western Europe between 1430 and 1630 are unique. No other period of human history before the Industrial Revolution witnessed a similar spate of rapid technological innovations on both land and sea, accompanied by such profound intellectual, social, political, and economic transformations. 4, and finally, this is the last chapter of the book. The military revolution produces asymmetrical conflicts. Asymmetrical within Europe. If you've gone through the military revolution, if you've changed your army and your navy, you will defeat your European enemies. But the asymmetry extends beyond Europe. European powers, Western powers, which have undergone the military revolution, will now prevail over their enemies elsewhere. By 1775, the eve of the American Revolution, that foolish, foolish era of my compatriots, by 1775, the military revolution had allowed relatively small groups of Europeans to conquer Siberia, to conquer most of the Americas and the Philippines, and parts of Africa and South Asia. In fact, by 1775, the West rules 1/3 of the world's landmass, and it dominates all the seas. There is nowhere non-European ships can go in safety. Several aspects of this argument have produced controversy, notably the chronological framework. Some critics, perhaps misreading my title, assumed that my military revolution spanned the period 1500 to 1800 and objected correctly that no revolution can last for 3 centuries. Others feel that the medieval precedents are the ones that really matter. Jeremy Black argues that the real innovations happen after 1600. Now, establishing a chronology for major changes is always challenging because, of course, there are precedents. Some things begin to change earlier. And, of course, there are outliers. Some things change later. But scholars in other fields have developed paradigms to explain this. Consider diplomatic history. John Eikenberry, whose name is the 4th one down on the sheet that was handed outside too, John Eikenberry has written of what he calls ordering moments, which he defined as the settlements of great power conflicts when the rules and institutions of the international order are on the table for negotiation and change. 1945 is obviously one. I would argue that 1989 is obviously another. Each ordering moment creates, to quote Eikenberry, a sort of constitutional framework in which the subsequent flow of international relations takes place. The paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, whose book comes after that one, by contrast wrote of a process of what he called punctuated equilibrium in biological evolution, in which there's a long period of equilibrium or incremental change, punctuated by short bursts of radical changes and corresponding adjustments. My military revolution, not being possessive here, I'm just separating it from Michael Roberts's. My military revolution suggests that an ordering moment or a punctuation in military affairs occurred in early modern Europe, consisting of the rapid emergence of capital ships, the artillery fortress, and firepower as the dominant elements in European warfare by land and sea, leading to a major increase in army and navy size. But the definition I like best comes from Williamson Murray, and it appears in this book, The Dynamics of Military Revolution, published in 2001. And Murray offered a subjective metric for identifying revolutions, but I think it's a really good one. Listen to Murray and then I'll parse what he's saying. The extent, he's looking at warfare on the Western Front in World War I, just 1 century ago. As Professor Trevillon said, if you go to a bookshop at the moment, 1914 is in fashion again. 1915, probably less so. 2015, we'll see. So, 1914. The extent of the revolution is clear enough between 14 and 18. A British or German battalion commander from summer 1918 could have understood the underlying concepts governing warfare in 1940, 1944, or even 1991. But a 1914 battalion commander magically transported to the Western Front battlefields in summer 1918, just 3.5 years later, wouldn't have understood a thing. Would have been totally foreign. He would have had great difficulty in understanding what he saw. So let's apply this paradigm, the Murray paradigm, to land warfare in early modern Europe. If Gustavus Adolphus rose up from wherever he is now, let's assume he's going upwards rather than downwards, and was magically transported to the Western Front in 1914, Gustavus Adolphus, commander of the most effective army of his day, would have understood the underlying concepts governing warfare with little difficulty once he had overcome his insane envy of the superior firepower and manpower available to his successors. It is not that different between Lutzen in 1632 and the Battle of the Marne in 1914. Holger Herwig, in that same volume by Murray, posits a similar paradigm for naval warfare. He writes, the number of guns aboard warships roughly doubled between 1700 and 1815, but the basic formula, tiers of muzzle loaders firing broadsides, had not changed. Tactics had correspondingly changed little. And if we take the Herwig paradigm for naval warfare back to English warfare in 1588, the English warships that defeat the Spanish Armada, what would we find? If Howard of Effingham or Sir Francis Drake had been magically transported to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, they would have understood everything that was going on. The attack, crossing the T, the bombardment. Of course, they too would have had to master their insane envy of the superior firepower and sail power available to Horatio Nelson. But if they and Nelson had been magically transported to the Battle of Jutland, 1916, they wouldn't have understood anything that was going on. Ironclad, steamships, fewer but far more powerful guns, torpedoes, aerial spotters, radio intercepts, and these ships are not affected by the winds or the tides. They would have been totally at sea. To make a terrible English pun, I do regret that. So, the new military revolution, military revolution 2.0, begins by charting these ordering moments in land warfare in Western Europe. The emergency of gunpowder artillery, capable of smashing walls, of an artillery fortress capable of withstanding gunpowder artillery, and of volley fire by infantry armed with muskets supported by field artillery. In each of these developments, there is a period of experiment, a period of trial and error, a period of punctuated evolution, often prolonged. But by 1630, it's all been sorted out. By the time of Gustavus Adolphus, you have a field army which will operate in the same way that it will do right down to 1914. The scale will change. The tactics will not. Chapter 2 will look at a similar ordering moment in naval warfare, the birth of the ship of the line in Atlantic Europe, and its deployment in fleet actions, culminating in the battles of the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the mid-17th century, in which opposing fleets fired thousands of heavy caliber rounds at each other for many hours and sometimes for several days. These sailing warships will rule the waves until the introduction of ironclad steamships 2 centuries later. So I'm going to argue that in this very narrow band, that around 1630, the first ship of the line, the first line action, is the Battle of the Downs in 1637. The first battle in which you really have two armies just firing away at each other with their artillery and their small arms is Lutzen in 1632. And just in parenthesis here, do you guys do battlefield archaeology? There's this sensational new development called battlefield archaeology, in which archaeologists are going out to the military sites, the battlefield sites which still survive, using new techniques, triangulating, using their excavations to show exactly where things happen, how things happen, in a way that you can put together with the written accounts. It's just absolutely exciting. The two most interesting ones are Bosworth Field, 1485, the battle that decides the fate of England. The Plantagenets die out. Richard III is literally killed on the battlefield. We know that because we've now found his body, his corpse, which was excavated 2 years ago in Leicester. He goes out from Leicester as a king. Before the battle, he comes back tied over the back of a horse, and you can see some of the wounds. He's been stabbed as he goes by. And Henry Tudor becomes the king. The battlefield archaeology has shown exactly where that happens. They found a little badge, a little white heart, the badge of the Lancastrian, of the Yorkist dynasty, and they found where the guns were firing on him because they can see the scatter. They can work out where they were coming from. The problem for Leicester, and as someone born in Nottingham, this gives me great glee, is that they have put the Bosworth Battlefield Commemoration Centre 3 miles away from where the battle took place. They got it wrong. But the archaeology is irrefutable. That's where the battle took place. So the first one is Bosworth. The second one is Lutzen. No good going to Breitenfeld. It's under a large suburb of Leipzig. But Lutzen is still open field, and battlefield archaeology has shown exactly where some of the major actions take place. It's possible to put together first-person accounts of what happened on one side and on the other, and to find exactly where the men died. Again, the most graphic image, if I thought this through a little, I would have actually brought you a couple of illustrations. But there's a particular place where you see a whole line of bullets, and they've all obviously hit something very hard because they're crumpled. They're lead and they're all crumpled up and they're all in a line. And the only explanation people can think of is they hit a rank of musketeers, because they're all standing in the line. There's no trees on Lutzen battlefield. There's no barricades mentioned in the sources. There are just these lines of musketeers, and one supposes that there's a couple of Swedish volleys which just takes them out. And these are the bullets, in fact, that kill them. So it's very evocative. But this is a game changer in trying to identify the way in which battles were fought. So Lutzen is, I think, the first battle which is fought in the new way. That way will survive down to 1914. Naval, yes, I'm sorry. I got excited and carried away. I'm sorry, it sometimes happens, especially when I'm in Paris. So chapter 1 of the military revolution will look at the evolution of land warfare, more or less up to Lutzen, by which time I think we can say we have this ordering moment. This is a new game we're playing. This is the way wars were before. In chapter 2, I shall argue the same thing for the first line-ahead battle, which is the Battle of the Downs, where the Dutch take out the Spanish fleet. Chapter 3 will look at the growth of larger armies and navies and a new integrated way of fighting with them, what today we would call a system of systems. And that in turn led to unprecedented logistical challenges. Some states react by attempting greater centralization, what the late Jan Gliet called the fiscal military state or the fiscal naval state. Britain, of course, is a fiscal naval state, whereas Sweden is a fiscal military state. Governments elsewhere go in for what David Parrott, you had David Parrott over here? Yeah. He invented this term military devolution. In other words, governments farming out things like recruiting, like supply. It's a reasonable response in the 16th and 17th century, but it is not the way of the future. The way of the future is the fiscal military state, the fiscal naval state, and that is what prevails in Europe by the mid-17th century. Most European states have acquired the capacity to maintain standing armies and also often permanent navies of unprecedented size. Naval superiority, I still think, is very, very important. I think it's an integral part of the military revolution because it offered the states of Atlantic Europe an opportunity to extend their conflicts far beyond their own shores. This will still be the last chapter of the book, the military revolution abroad. Until the 1590s, the Europeans expand with very little expenditure on arming their ships because it's them and the non-Europeans. They don't need heavy armament, but when the Dutch and the English start going out there, it becomes necessary for the Spanish and the Portuguese to arm their ships as well. And they don't do it as effectively, it has to be said. The ordering moment there, and it's purely arbitrary, but it's spectacular. The 9th of May, 1624. We're back in May. The 9th of May, 1624. That's even almost an anniversary. The Dutch pull off an extraordinary coup. Envisage, if you will, South America. On the Atlantic coast, you have Bahia de Todos os Santos, and you have the town of Salvador, which the Dutch capture on the 9th of May, 1624. And on the other side, the Pacific coast, a Dutch fleet appears off Callao, the port of Lima. It doesn't take it, but boy oh boy, the ability to have two fleets, both sent from Europe, a year apart, so that they will attack on the same day. That's an extraordinary feat of power projection. I can't think of a parallel. That's the beginning of global imperialism. 3,000 miles from Salvador to Callao. But the Dutch had planned it that way to take down their arch-enemy, the King of Spain. And from this point onwards, Atlantic states send ever larger expeditions to wrest control of America and also coastal Africa and Asia from their rivals. I don't think the West expands between 1500 and 1800 because of its moral superiority or its material superiority. I think it's its military superiority at which we must look. As with naval expansion, as long as the troops of only one European power sought to expand abroad, the Spaniards and the Portuguese in America, the Russians in Siberia. Even a slight advantage, particularly firearms, conferred a decisive advantage over societies that lacked the same technological and political composition. Once the agents of competing European powers arrived in an area, however, the ability of the Western warriors to innovate, a skill learned in the numerous conflicts at home, gave them the military edge even against the most technically and politically advanced societies such as India and China. Let me wrap up and then we can go on to the questions and answers. The last book, or the last three books on your list, you will notice, are really nothing much about military revolution. First is by David Fieldhouse, an economic historian who wrote in 1973 his book Economics and Empires, 1830 to 1914. And he puts forward a figure which reappears time after time after time over the past 40 years. He writes, the proportion of the world's land surface actually occupied by Europeans, whether under direct European control as colonies or as one-time colonies, was 35% in 1800, 67% in 1878, and 84% in 1914. 1914 is the apogee of Western dominance. That's 1973. In 1981, 8 years later, Daniel Hedrick took this striking claim as the starting point for his influential study, The Tools of Empire, Technology and European Imperialism in the 19th Century. And in it, Hedrick described, and I'm going to quote, the relationship between technological innovations and the European colonial conquests. Among the factors that explain this dramatic expansion, certain technological innovations, in particular steam engines, better firearms, and medical advantages, played a major role. Technology is now widely recognized as a necessary, if not sufficient, explanation for the new imperialism. In 2010, 25 years after his first book, Hedrick revisited his earlier assertions. He stood by his definition of technology. For Hedrick, technology is, and I quote, all the ways in which humans use the materials and energy in the environment for their own ends, beyond what they can do with their bodies. But he then went on to wonder, if one accepts the idea that technological innovations were essential to the European conquests of the 19th century, does it then follow that technological factors explain other conquests at other times in the past? Or was the case of 19th century European imperialism a fluke? I take up that rhetorical question in the military revolution. And I ask that question of these 3 centuries before the 19th century. In 1500, the states of Western Europe lay claim to less than 7% of the world's habitable land. But by 1775, they could lay claim to just over 1/3, just as Fieldhouse had said, as well as all its oceans. That's a 5-fold increase. And in that 5-fold expansion, the 3 technological innovations which seem to me crucial are the evolution of the artillery fortress, the evolution of the sailing warship, and the evolution of massed firepower. So, 19th century imperialism was neither a fluke nor an aberration, but rather part of the rise of the West that begins in the 16th century. The military revolution argued in 1988, and will argue in 2014 or whenever I finish the damn thing, that the armies and navies of the early modern states and their descendants in the industrial age played the most important role in establishing Western dominance over almost the entire world by 1914, just 1 century ago. Thank you.